So getting started, we're going to do getting started with Blazor WebAssembly. For those of you, again, who don't know me, my name is Nathan Westfall. I'm a software engineering manager over at Tyler Technologies. I've been doing mobile development in Xamarin for a few years. Always been doing web development. Blazor is kind of what makes me now like web development more. So I always enjoyed it, but like everyone else, or a few people in .NET, I hate that I have to learn a new JavaScript library every month. There's always something new, something different that people are using. So Blazor kind of married the best of mobile and web into the same thing. So what is Blazor? Actually, real quick, as I'm looking at the attendees here, raise your hand if you've heard of Blazor before. And I mean, before you signed up for this, obviously by now, hopefully you know what the word Blazor is. Okay, yep. Cool. Everyone from Tyler is because I talk about it nonstop, but cool. Good to see a lot of people already know about it. So cool. All right. Basically you can build client apps with C#, right? As we know, the modern stack today is HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then I have a web application. This now allows you to build interactive apps with C#. So .NET developers who aren't really familiar with JavaScript can now build in C#. You can still connect to JavaScript, and we'll get into how you can do that using their Interop library. You can run it either on the server or the client. So the server implementation is very similar to web forms. As we might know, that's not being supported in .NET Core anymore, but it's the same kind of idea. Or client side, which client side is now competing with Angular SPA applications, React SPA applications, kind of anything that was meant to run 100% in the browser. You get to share more code, right? It is .NET. So .NET Standard came out a while ago, and now .NET Standard is the way that you can basically say these set of APIs will work on mobile, they'll work on a web, they'll work on console, and now they'll work in the browser. And basically just empowers you to do more with .NET. Blazor Server, which we'll show a little bit of, but this is kind of the one that looks more familiar to web forms. So what it basically does is you run a server in your hosting or cloud provider, and then as components change, it actually uses SignalR to send those changes over to the browser, and then those browser changes are made in, I'm going to say, near real time, right? As we know, if I click a button, the path is actually, I click button, SignalR goes to the server, and then server has to generate all the DOM changes, and those DOM changes come back serialized in SignalR, and then a JavaScript library computes it out. So it's pretty fast if you have a good internet connection, but if you don't have a good internet connection, you can see lag because kind of all of the rendering is done on the server. And again, a server connection is required, right? That's one of the downsides of it, as we talk about into a SPA application or something like that, we'll do later on. WebAssembly, and this is the one that we're going to cover for the most part. WebAssembly is 100% .NET rendering, all that stuff in the browser. So it's a single page application, and it works with WebAssembly. That's how they did it. On top of WebAssembly, you also have all that .NET code running in the browser, and the way it does is it uses the linker and the everything else that Mono did so well and makes it compile down to WebAssembly code, and then WebAssembly then runs in the browser. No servers required, which we'll get into some architectural designs later on how you can actually deploy your application with 0 servers. The only downside is you have a slower startup, and we'll see why. It's not as big of a deal because it is one time, it's then cached, and you're good to go. But essentially, because .NET runs on the browser, you have to download your DLLs to the browser, have them cache, and then your application starts up. JavaScript Interop, we talked about, right? So this is how, obviously, I can't do everything in .NET, right? There's still, I can't quite interact with DOM elements like I want to in WebAssembly yet, as WebAssembly is only version 1.0. But I can talk to JavaScript. And as we know, JavaScript can do anything under the sun, probably more than it should. But .NET can use this interface that Microsoft makes available called IJS Runtime, and there's a more advanced version of that called IJS Process and Runtime, which we'll use in WebAssembly. And basically, that allows you to interact with your JavaScript, someone else's JavaScript, the browser's JavaScript, and make all those calls back and forth. It can both be .NET to JavaScript, and it can be JavaScript to .NET. This works both in Server and WebAssembly, so you don't need to just have the WebAssembly version to talk to JavaScript. Again, we talked about the share more code. It uses .NET Standard 2.1. Some things still aren't available that are available in .NET Standard. So same as JavaScript, same as running in kind of the Chrome sandbox or Edge sandbox or whatever browser you're running in. You're kind of placed in this little sandbox environment. You don't have access to the file system. I can't just go open up ports and sockets all the time. And as of right now, there's no threading. They have async await support. It's kind of weird, but it is there. But there's no explicit, I want to create a thread and then run all this stuff on the thread. So, all right. And this is where the fun stuff happens. We're going to get right into the demo. Any questions thus far? No. Cool. OK. All right. So as you can see here, I'm going to very quickly create my project real quick. And what this bash command is about to do is I'm going to create a shared library. So this is basically .NET defines it as a Razor class lib. What this basically does, I want to build a shared library for Razor components. We're not going to use it right away, but we're going to create it for later. I want to create a Blazor server. This is where I want Blazor, but I want that server implementation we were talking about. And then Blazor WASM. WASM stands for WebAssembly. I want to create that one as well, and that's what we'll spend a lot of the time. So I'm going to go ahead and create this. This will create my shared project. So you can see my component. It'll create my server. This should look familiar, right? Program, startup, pages, that sort of thing. And then WASM, which is just program, and then all this other stuff. So if I go into one of these right now, let's do the server one, right? I just do cd Blazor server app and .NET run. Then I'll build my project, and it should start on port 5000. Same thing we're used to seeing. So there we go. Just switch this over. And localhost 5000. If I go here, I now have a Blazor application, right? Your standard .NET thing. So if I look at the network connectivity real quick, right? And I go to counter. Click, right? I can do all this fun stuff. And what's actually happening behind the scenes, I know it's kind of hard to see right here. It's actually creating a signal R. I might not have it be able to show. Yeah, I'm filtering them out. But what you're basically doing is all this interaction is actually coming all the way back to the server, rendering those DOM changes and then setting it back. But as you can see, here's my home page. Here's my counter. If I look at my counter page, right, I'm basically just defining a page / counter. That's how it gets where I'm supposed to go. If I make it something generic, it's going to freak out, say there's nothing at this address. It'll then render this in the page. And then I have actual C# code, right? So I basically say current count is equal to a variable called current count, right? 0. And then button on button click to increment count. This increment count then calls a private function that just increments this number. So I can click, and then it's actually running C# code to do that back. Now that's cool, but it's not 100% running in the browser. So let's go ahead and jump to that version. Do the same thing, .NET run. And actually, if I shut this down, you can see attempting to connect to the server, right? It requires the server to run in order for me to do this. Here's all the signal R stuff I was talking about. Now it's starting to fail. So now let's do Blazor WebAssembly. It'll do the same thing. It'll stand up the server for you. It's not actually a server that's running, but .NET will stand one up for you just so that you can get the bits onto your browser. So now if I go here, as you can see, that loading, right? We didn't have that with the server version. It kind of took a second there. And if I go to application and cache storage, I have this new resource called Blazor resources. And if I go into here, just like I thought, right? Here's some DLLs, all these DLLs that we need. Some of these are from a past project, but it still requires some of these to download before the application can actually run. The benefit being is as long as you don't have an update or something critical, it does hash these out so it knows what needs to be updated. So the next load is actually going to be faster. I just did without cache, but if I load again, it'll, pretty considerable speeds. So same functionality, right? I can click counter, I can click count. It's running that same .NET code, but now it's all in the browser. So if I close out this server, right, application shut down, I don't have that same error message. I can go home, I can go back to counter, I can still use my application with no connection, and even to show it more, right, I'll turn my network offline, look at that, and I can still do it 100% as if it was a SPI application, no interaction, .NET running in the browser. Pretty cool. So some people want to build shared components, right? Let's say that counter page, I have the code in server, right? And I have the exact same page in WebAssembly, right? Let's just say I want to create a shared component, share my code, and be done with it. So in my shared library, I have a component 1, right? So I just have this one component. Let's go ahead and rename this to state counter, and the state will come in handy later, but we'll just call it state counter. And then what we're going to do is in my counter, I'm actually just going to copy this code and paste it here. Now, as you can see, same exact elements, but now in my Razor page. And what I can do here, I have to add this in here. So first we have to add a reference, right? This isn't anything new if you've been working with .NET. Shared, right? And now I have a project reference back to that. I'm just going to copy this and put it in WASM as well. Perfect. And now I should be able to go and do state counter, right? If I build this right now, so I'm in the server version right now. If I go ahead and build this, I should get a build failure. And it's going to say, oh, I didn't know what I was doing. Oh, include. I can never get this one right. There we go, include. Yep, okay. But either way, it should error out for a different reason now. It should tell me that my component, look at that. So either way, what you should be doing is using Blazor shared app. And what this does, this goes back to web forms. This works on WebAssembly, this works on server, it works on all of them. But basically, this giant imports file lets you know what namespaces you're supposed to be using when you're doing C# rendering. So now that I have that in there, .NET run. Oh, okay. It didn't error out, but here is the warning, right? Markup found, state counter. If it's intended to be a component, use that using directive. So it did what it was supposed to, just not as an error. All right, now we have it running. And if I go ahead and refresh this, there we go. And click counter, just as before, right? Let me go ahead and do state counter, just so that we know it's a different component, right? My counter page is still just that, but my state counter is a totally different page. Refresh, and now it says state counter, right? Same code, just as a shared component. So now if I go to WASM, my WebAssembly one, say I do the same thing, right? We're going to do using Blazor shared app, go to my counter, take all this code out, and do shared counter, right? Or state counter. And now I run that. I'm going to stop switching back and forth. All right, here's my WAS map, same state counter. Oh, I did the right shortcut, that would help. It's going to build, run on the same one. Same state counter, WASM, state counter. All same code, running between server and browser, no difference. Now, let's say I wanted to do something different with this state counter, right? Let's say by default, rather than have this current count increment by 1, I wanted it to increment by 5, or something like that. Or maybe I wanted my server to do 2 and WASM to do 5. What you can do on these components is you can actually create parameters. So if I do public integer, and we'll call it increment amount get set, and we'll default to 1. You can set an attribute called parameter. And what this is doing is now if I do current count equals current count plus increment amount, right? So by default, it'll be 1. It'll behave the same way it did before. But now if I go to my WASM application and I should have increment amount equals 5. So now I'm basically saying draw my state counter, but by default increment it amount of 5 instead of 1. So if I save that, rerun. Refresh this, go to 0, and now I'm going up by 5, right? Just like that. I can go to my server application and do the same thing, but I'm going to do increment amount equals 2. Run that application. There we go. Now it's server. And now it's going up by 2, right? Same component, but now with a parameter, I'm telling it to do X instead of Y, which is great, right? So you can kind of imagine the use cases here, right? Maybe I'm building a UI library. Maybe I'm doing something with callbacks. Maybe I wanted to display different headers, different text, but still have the same buttons and all that other stuff. You can pass in parameters to do that. Now, this application's great, right? But as you can see, when I refresh the page, it doesn't remember my count, right? I'm back down to 0, doesn't do anything for me. Or even if I go to the home page and then back to counter, it's back at 0, right? Redraws the page, we don't want that. So calling it a state counter, wouldn't it be great if there was a way that it could have a state, right? So if I switch between home and counter, it stayed the same amount. What I'm going to do is create a new service. So let's just do state counter service. Namespace, Blazor shared app, public state counter service, and then public in count. We'll just call it count, and we'll set it at 0. Okay, real simple. Class doesn't need to do anything, nothing special, right? Now, if I go to my state counter razor, rather than have this current count, I'm going to take this out. I can also now go into the top of my page. Excuse me. Top of my page, and now I want to use this state counter, right? Rather than have my variable there, which now no longer exists, I want to use this. Can actually inject this class. So I'm going to go to the top and use inject state counter service, state counter service. And now I'm saying I want, using dependency injection, the same thing we use in .NET Core that we've been using for a while, I can now use in Blazor. So now down here, I'm going to have state counter dot service. Look at that. Now it's a class now. Count equal state counter service dot count plus increment amount. Come up here, do the same thing. State counter service dot count. Right? Boom. Ready to go. So now if I go ahead and, one more thing we got to do. So that's great, right? As we all know, though, when we do services like that, we have to actually set them up for dependency injection. So if I go down here at the end of this, we're going to do builder.services, right? Nothing new. I'm going to add a scope service, and it's going to be Blazor shared app dot state counter service. And now it's available, right? Copy this line. Just this part, go to my server project and do the same thing. Services dot boom, add scoped service, and there we go. So now if I run this application using my new stateful counter, real original naming, it should, when I switch between home and counter, it should keep that count, right? So if I refresh this, counting, all good. Home, counter, stays at 16, right? Now I'm keeping that state between the two pages using that dependency injection, right? Now to show something interesting, right? If I refresh the page, it would have gone back down to 0, right? It would have, because it's scope, so it's just for that request. If I set this as a singleton, right? Singleton meaning it should be open for the lifetime of the application. So if I set this as a singleton and run it, we should now see, because it's running on the server, right? It should have that, because it renders on the server, that service should be available server side. So if I change this to 8 and refresh the page, it's still 8, right? Home, back, 8, refresh, still 8, okay? That makes sense. The singleton runs on the server. Now, what happens if I do that in WASM, right? So right now, as the WASM app is, it is still running in scope. I'm gonna do .NET Watch just to make this a little faster. If I go down to program, right, it's still set as scoped. So it's just per the request. If I do .NET Run, and go to the counter page, right? Same thing, switch back, it's fine. But if I refresh, it goes back to 0. Now, let's say I set this to add singleton, right? Let it rebuild. Let it do its thing. Now it's listening again. Okay, I can still set it. I can still switch, refresh, back to 0. Now, why is that? Okay. So when I run it as a singleton, and this might be obvious for some people, but if I run it as a singleton, right, it's for the lifetime of that process. If I'm running this in WebAssembly and it's on my browser, if I refresh, I'm essentially restarting the application, right? All of its memory gets dumped. It's no longer running as an application. That's why when I do singleton in server, it works because the server is still running and it'll keep the state of that service. WebAssembly, if I refresh the page, even though it's a singleton, because all the .NET code is running in the browser serverless, its service is cleared, its state is cleared. So we want to make this a little bit better though, right? We want to be able to support both use cases, and we can use this using local storage. So as we all know, there's this great JavaScript library, windows.localstorage, right? That lets me get items, set items, and kind of manage local storage in my browser, right? So if I come here, right, here's something I have already in local storage from a different application. So this is my key, this is my value, simple key value storage, right? Nothing crazy. Okay, so going back to my shared project, and we'll close out of this right now. We have this example JS Interop class that gets created automatically. And if we go into it, we can see that it's just a class with the static method called prompt. I pass in this JS runtime with a message, and it invokes async some name in the message, right? If I go to my www root folder, which in most .NET applications means it's a static file, you'll see that there is a example JS interop.js file, and I have functions here that I can do, right? So what we're going to do is we're actually going to write some JavaScript. Painful, but we're going to write some JavaScript, and then we're going to call that JavaScript in .NET. So if I come here, we're going to do set count, right? Function count, and we'll do window.localstorage, localstorage.set item, Blazor state count, and count. So I just set my item. Let's do get count, which will be function, and then window.localstorage.get item, Blazor state count. We want to return this, and we want to make sure it's in. Here, we got to do this actually. Item equals this. If item does not equal null, then we're going to return parse int of item, otherwise return 0. Okay, so now we have two functions. We have set count and get count. If I go to JS Interop, we'll keep this right now, right? Value task, it's a new version of task in C# 8.1. And now we'll do this. So we'll make one that says set count. that returns nothing. And we will want one that does get count that returns an integer. All right, so let's focus on set count real quick. So we're going to pass in the JS runtime, which we'll get to, and we're going to pass in the count. So now I have int count. Come down here, and we are going to, if we go to JS runtime, I can invoke async, or I can invoke void async. Void means I want nothing back, right? It's a void function. There's nothing that's coming back. So I'm going to do invoke void async. Example functions, set count, because that's what I named my function, and I have a variable count, right? So example functions dot set count, that's my object, that's my function, and then that's my parameter, right? Basically just pass in a list of parameters after the name of the function that you want to pass to JavaScript. Take this out, and there we go. Now I have my, I gotta return it. There we go. My set count. Now, if I go to get count, we're going to keep invoke async this time. We're going to make it an integer. We're not passing anything in, so we just need the JS runtime. So I don't need anything else. And then we called this function get count, right? No parameters, just straight get count. And there we go. So now I have two interop functions that I can call in .NET that basically call my set count in JavaScript and my get count in JavaScript, one returning a value, one just setting it. So if I go to my state counter, right, when I increment count, right, don't ever do this, but we'll make it an async void, and then we'll just do await example JS interop set count equals my state count service dot count, and now it should be setting that count. Now, I also need to inject this. So another thing you can inject, right? IJS runtime, IJS runtime, and IJS runtime. It's going to tell me this doesn't exist because in here using Microsoft.js interop, and now I can use that library. There we go. So I have a way to set my count right there, but I now need to get it, right? So how would I do that? Well, again, just like web forms, I'm not trying to compare this to web forms either. I know that I'm saying that a lot, but if you've ever worked with web forms, you're kind of used to building things out as components. Everything has a life cycle, and that's what we're about to use. We're about to use a life cycle of the page. So if I go to my protected override on, I have a few options here. I have on after render, on initialize, and on parameter set, all with an async option, which is awesome, right? How many times have we gotten overrides and there's been no async option to actually do it? So this is great. So you have on initialize, which is when the object is first created. You have on parameter set, which is if I ever change increment count or something else, I set a parameter that's going to get called. And then I have on after render. On after render is not just the first time, but anytime the DOM needs to update, right? So if I click me and then the count changes, right? That's technically after that render of changing that count, it'll call this function. The benefit being if you have this flag called first render. So you can know the first time it was rendered, you know, do an if statement for it and go through it. We're going to do after render async. The reason for that being is you can't call JavaScript Interop on Blazor Server in on initialized. You can do it with WebAssembly because it's all in the browser, but the server will not let you call on after or not let you call JS Interop in on initialized. So for compatibility's sake, we're just going to make it on after. So I'm going to do async task. Don't need this. I don't know why VS Code generates this. And now we're going to say on first render, right? So if first render, then we're going to do state count service dot count equals await example JS get my count, right? So it's going to get the count and put it right back. And JS runtime is what you need. Hi, JS runtime. So there we go. So now we have this state component that both after it renders for the first time, it'll get the count from local storage using JavaScript Interop. And then every time we increment, it'll call JavaScript again and increment that local storage. So all we have to do is we actually might be good. Let's just try it, see what happens. We might have to inject IJS runtime. Sometimes it's by default, sometimes it's not. Can't remember if this sample project includes it. So, yep, it didn't. Oh, I lied. So one more thing you have to do, right? So we have the project reference, but we need to include this JavaScript file, right? It just doesn't come out of thin air. So if I go to my WASM application, I have a www root folder, just like my other one, and you'll see this index.html file. This got created for you automatically. It's always in there. And what it does is basically gives the UI a place to start, right? So while it's WebAssembly, while it runs in there, it's awesome, but I need an index, HTML to then set up WebAssembly, right? And that's what this does right here. So basically shows that loading that you see and then starts WebAssembly. Blazor just says, yep, I'll handle your DLLs, I'll handle your packages, I'll take care of that, start the project, you're good to go. So what we need to do here is just do script src content, name of my shared project, and then the name of my JavaScript file. So content means it's coming from a project reference or a package reference, like a NuGet package, the name of my assembly, and then the file that I want, right? So that should work. I can just refresh. WASM shared app would be the correct name. There we go. And then there we go, right? No errors. So now if I go to application, right? Nothing in local storage. I'm going to click me. Look at that. Now I have JavaScript being called into from .NET, right? So now if I refresh the page, right? So this is 25, refresh the page. Doesn't start off as 25, right? Why is that? Why did that happen, right? Maybe let me go to my JavaScript, make sure it calls, right? So here's my JavaScript file. Let me set a breakpoint, refresh the page. It's getting called, right? So I know my interop works. I'm getting a value back, right? Here's item, it's getting 25. But if I come back, didn't change, right? Didn't change. Flip around. Oh, look at that. After I went and came back to the page, now it worked again. I wonder why that is. So in Blazor, sometimes it doesn't know when property is changed, right? I'm kind of doing this in a protected method, overriding something. I'm kind of doing it right after it renders on its first render. I'm doing an async call. I should let Blazor know, hey, I just changed something. You're going to have to check for changes. All you have to do is anytime that happens, you will do state has changed. And then the magic happens, right? So with that change, we'll go ahead and run this again. And basically all this is saying is, hey, I changed this count. The state has changed. You probably need to redraw. You probably need to figure out what's different. So now refreshing this. First load, right? I'll do it again. First load. Now it loads that current count, right? I'm saying, hey, I called an async call. I got this value back. Now the state has changed. Let's go ahead and update it, right? And I can go through here and I can keep going. Everything works. 55, refresh, 55. Okay. Same thing works in server. So what did we do? We took this script file, right? We also have one in here. If I can find it. The server one's always a little weird. There's always a starting host. They put it in underscore host because it's technically a server. As you can see, though, the underscore host file, other than some namespace, pages, tag helper stuff, it's still HTML. So I'm going to come down here, put my script file, and now go ahead and run Blazor Server. And I should get the same functionality, right? So I'm still gonna, it should load with whatever that value was, 55. So now if I go here, Blazor Server, 55, and now it's still incrementing, right? Still going to the server and back, but it's still interacting with my JavaScript. So all that .NET stuff is still right there. So pretty cool, right? How all that works. So that might be great, right? That might be cool to see how all that works. Let me try that again. But how can I use this for a real world application, right? We're incrementing a number right now, right? How does that translate to something I can use in a real world application? So a few things. We're not going to show this just because it's a pain to set up if you ever worked with it, but it does work with OAuth 2, right? And that's not because the library sucks. OAuth 2 is just a giant thing to undertake, unless you're using something like Auth0 or something like that. But it works with OAuth 2, right? So it follows the same pattern a SPA application would. I'm going to redirect to your ID serve. I'm going to log in, and you're going to come back with an ID token, an access token, so I can start making calls against the API and have context to my user. This makes it easier for .NET developers to move to web development, right? So you might be a shop where you have a bunch of web developers who are used to web forms, right? Maybe a .NET desktop application. The fact that everything's kind of built in components, and if I have someone on my team who knows how to do that JavaScript interop, I can just call functions, right? And that's good for me, right? If I'm a .NET developer, I know how to do async await calls, and I can just call your method and be done with it. I don't need to know that you created 100 lines of JavaScript to do one thing, right? I can just call .NET, and I'm happy with that. You can build reusable components that can be used in multiple projects. So if I have a menu bar that I want in all my applications, I can just build a Razor component like we saw and share that between everything. You can build whole UI libraries. So there's some great ones out there. One's called Radzin, which is pretty much Bootstrap with some added stuff. There's one for material design. There's one for ant design. Basically, you can take any existing CSS or your own CSS and HTML UI library and move it to Blazor so that I can just call Blazor components and you set it up all up for me, right? I don't have to initialize anything. I don't have to call into anything. I can just pass you parameters of how I want it to look, and bam, there it is. Single page apps on top of your existing APIs. This is what Tyler is doing. This is a ton of fun, is where we have all these APIs, and a lot of companies now have a lot of APIs, or you just use other people's APIs. Being able to quickly build another application on top of it with OAuth 2 and those existing APIs is great. You don't have to develop this giant framework to build a application designed to do one thing, right? We're not building Blazor applications that do 1,000 different things. It kind of takes that microservices architecture and brings it to a SPA application. And that goes right into quick and easy PWA applications, right? So there's you know how everything's going with Epic Games and Basecamp and all that other stuff. It's sometimes a pain to get your application into the App Store, right? Apple has this whole process that you have to go through. Google Play, not as bad, but they're starting to get stricter with their API usage and that sort of thing. You can build a PWA, publish the link, and you're done, right? You can just build a quick application, say I want this to be a PWA, which .NET has a flag for that just says make my Blazor WASM app a PWA. And if they add it to their phone, then I'm 100% now running on my phone, right? It caches all the information for me, shows up as an icon. I can click it and use it just like a native application. And now, rather than do that with a bunch of JavaScript libraries and CDNs and all this other stuff, you can just, with Blazor, compile it once, click add, and now you're running .NET as a kind of native-like application on your phone. All right, so a real life example. So I'm not going to get too much into it, but there is an application that Tyler built called Tyler Bus Attendance. It's out on the web, so I'm not saying anything that I shouldn't be, but this is 100% built with Blazor, right? We had an existing API. We use OAuth. That's why there's logout buttons. There's all this other stuff that's here. And I can do some cool things, right? So this basically gets information back from our system, allows the user to do something, and then post back. Simple APIs. I don't think it has more than 4 endpoints that it actually hits. But it does a lot of cool things, right? So I might need to use the browser's current location. I can maybe switch to a different language, right? I might want to do multi-tenancy, which I'm doing. I might want to, this is an example of one of those UI libraries that we were talking about, right? I'm using one that fit our needs. And then it's a PWA, right? I can click this little add icon, and now I can install it as a desktop application or a mobile application right there, right? So now I can just see it's bus attendance. I can quit it. I can run it. But now it's .NET Blazor running as an application on my computer. with that, I mean, here's some of the things that we're using, right? We're using Blazor location, which basically has access to the JavaScript location API, so I can get my current lat long. I can watch for new lat long, so I can just follow where the user's going. Blazor DB, so IndexedDB is kind of like, I don't want to say it's SQLite in the browser because they're working on that, but it's a great way to basically have databases in the browser, right? They used to have WebDB, now it's IndexedDB. That's the one that's kind of supported across all browsers, including Safari. You can use that for caching data, which is what we use. Maybe you're trying to support offline scenarios where I submit data, but I don't have the internet, so I'm going to cache it for later and then submit it. Blazor Tenant, this is one actually that I wrote, so it's multi-tenancy in .NET. So based off my URL, I can hit a different API, I can hit a different OAuth server, I can do all these things right in Blazor. Blazor Camera, so you can do streaming of videos, streaming of photos, streaming of audio, kind of like you would for like a GoToMeeting online. Maybe you're using Teams online right now, right? That's using HTML5, JavaScript APIs to access your camera audio. You can do the same thing now in Blazor. Radzin, that's just the UI library we were talking about. Toolbelt is a great one. So it basically allows you to do multilingual support in Blazor. I know that .NET has resx files. I personally hate them because they're XML. They don't work well with VS for Mac. They don't work with VS Code. So what Toolbelt does is actually generates a nice JavaScript file that you can set your definitions in, automatically compiles C# files. So that way you could reference it in code. And then I wrote a library that basically goes through that JavaScript file, and you can use it with anything because again, it's just JSON, so it's super easy to serialize, deserialize, and uses AWS machine learning to generate translations. So you can obviously do custom ones, but if you wanted to very quickly just say, here's all my localization in English or Spanish or whatever you want to use and translate it, you can just quickly generate those JSON files, and it takes care of it for you. So the application I also just showed was 100% serverless. That was Blazor WebAssembly. There's no servers running. So this is just kind of an ideal deployment of how we figured it out to get it to work. This is an AWS. You can do the same thing in Azure, same thing in Google, same thing on your own server. But this is some of the things of how this works. Joe, I'll answer your question in 1 second. Yeah, that's a good question. So I have my application at myblazораpp.com, right? I hit that URL and it goes down to my CDN. This is CloudFront in AWS. We'll get into why I have a CDN in a second. The CDN then goes to the API gateway. And API gateway is, I think in Azure it's called application gateway. Basically just says at this URL do this. Maybe I want to apply CORS policies to it, which would be great since this is a SPA application. Or maybe I want to have different paths go to different servers, different files, whatever. And then behind my API gateway, I actually just have a giant S3 bucket. So actually when I do .NET publish, I take those files, dump them in S3, and my API gateway will now just serve those files up. One of the reasons we have the API gateway is for multi-tenancy. So if you're not doing multi-tenancy, you actually don't even need the API gateway. You can just do CloudFront to your file storage. The reason we did it is there's a manifest.json file that is required for PWA applications. What we didn't know at the time was the manifest has the name of the application and the start URL, right? So if I'm using the URL to determine multi-tenancy, that manifest JSON is going to change for every client. And I don't want to have 100 different JSON files for all my different clients. So what we actually do is manifest.json to the world is just a JSON file, but API gateway actually calls a Lambda function and generates that JSON on the fly. So that way it's a tenant specific JSON file. Again, if you're not doing multi-tenancy, you can scratch that. You don't have to worry about it. But for our case, that's how we did it. And then the CDN. The CDN is the big part when you go into deployment. And this is where it's really cool. So as we know, a CDN basically just caches files for you kind of on the edge so you can kind of access them at real quick speeds. They're used for, you probably use one for a JavaScript file, CSS file, maybe icons, right? Very quick way to access things. Well, it works great for Blazor, right? As we talked about for WebAssembly, the first step in all this is downloading those files, right? I need to download them in my browser before Blazor can run. CDN allows two things. One, my download times are great. It's not that S3 isn't fast, but having my files as close to the edge as possible makes it even better. So the CDN provides me that. It provides me the same context too. If I'm using CloudFront, is now I have my files cached East Coast, West Coast, Central, Europe, Canada, right? They're closer to the end user. I'm not locked to one region. The other place where it comes great is when you have to do an update, right? No one wants downtime. S3 is great, but obviously I can't copy all my files at the exact same time. So what we actually do is the CDN has a 24-hour cache on it. And the way it deploys is I do .NET build, .NET publish, take those published files, move them over to S3, and then just invalidate my CDN cache. Because ideally, what's happening is I'm requesting to S3. I no longer am requesting to S3 because all my files are cached in the CDN. I can update the S3. Users are still connecting because all the files are being stored from the CDN. And then I basically tell CDN, hey, invalidate your cache because there's new files. So the next time the user comes in, it'll go to the S3, pull those new files, and then recache them going forward. So basically, you can do deployments without any downtime, right? You're not taking the server down or the application down in this case for the user. So what's next, right? What's next with Blazor? So you can do a lot of cool things, right? It's not just desktop, but that's what's very cool. So JavaScript has moved over to mobile with Ionic and Cordova and a few other things, as well as to the desktop with Electron. The same guy who actually did the proof of concept for Blazor, Steve Sanderson, has another NuGet package called Web Window. And this, I see you, Paul, and this web window allows you to build Blazor on a desktop application. Xamarin Mobile Bindings does the same thing where I can take Blazor code and run it in Xamarin side by side with native code. So I can have the top part of my application actually be native iOS code and then have my shared UI be in Blazor, right? It's very similar to what we saw Xamarin do when I can write native code, but just have an Xamarin Forms component come over. They did the same thing with Blazor. Joe, to answer your question real quick, does state has change run change detection on the entire DOM or just the component and its children? It's just the component and its children from my understanding. Even sometimes the children don't play correctly, so you'll have to use kind of like event handlers to do it. But I've only noticed that if I'm using someone else's library. If it's my component in my component, then state has change will work for the children as well. Paul, if you want to unmute, you can ask your question.
Just be careful with web window. It's still marked experimental and hasn't had much.
I was just, yeah. It's definitely still experimental. I've had some good luck with it, but it's not 100% production yet. But I think it's great promise to show what it can do to compete with Electron. Because I used to build Electron. It was a great way to build desktop quick because I hate desktop UI. So using HTML was a lot easier. But yeah, it's still experimental, but shows great promise. It's a smaller package size. It's already hitting them in some performance. And with .NET 5, I think it'll really kick the performance even farther. So, and speaking of .NET 5, there's a lot of cool things that really help out with Blazor. So 3.1, so let me rephrase that. .NET 3.0, I believe, was the first release for Blazor Server. WebAssembly was in preview. Then .NET 3.1 came out, and shortly after, Blazor then hit GA for WebAssembly. .NET 5, they did a lot of improvements, a lot of performance for Blazor in general. They did a lot of work with Mono because Mono kind of had that first JIT compilation, that sort of thing. So they did a lot of cool stuff, and they promise even more in .6. Yeah, and this is actually a lot from Release Candidate 1. So I've been following it in GitHub for a while, and I'm super happy Release Candidate 1 actually just released all this stuff. So CSS isolation. So if you're used to regular Razor pages, right, I could basically have my styles header, right, and my scripts. In Blazor right now, you have to have them in one separate file, multiple separate files, put them in your index.html, and now they're just global, right? They're not specific to that component. You can now, with CSS and JavaScript, you can actually make them specific to your component. So you can do either one of those things. Lazy loading of areas. I haven't worked with this one yet, but just by the description, you can tell that it's not necessarily rendering components as it's rendering components all the time, right? It can kind of be smart about what it's rendering where. Protected browser storage. So I just showed you local storage. There's also session storage. Both these, there's great libraries and NuGet packages to do it. They're coming out with their own protected ones, so you can actually do kind of encryption to store those values, and it's kind of a nice API to do all that. All the performance optimizations, and then file uploads. File uploads right now is hard because of the JavaScript Interop being a little slow. Because you're basically saying, let's say I upload an image right now, I want the bytes of those image in .NET. It's got to basically put it into JavaScript. JavaScript's got to send it through WebAssembly and then WebAssembly to .NET. They did a lot of not only just performance around this, but they built a way in Blazor to do file uploads, and it's a great way to do it. Debugging in WebAssembly can be painful. I actually noticed with .NET 5 it's gotten a lot better. So this whole demo is actually on .NET 5. I was able to add in another project through VS Code. I could click start debugging. I set my browser to Edge instead of Chrome, set my file path, and it actually worked pretty well. So I know some of the limitations with debugging in Blazor WebAssembly is actually more on WebAssembly than .NET, just because that's kind of new. But .NET has come a long way to catch up to where everyone else is in terms of debugging. So, but yeah, server side works the same as it is because it's running on your server. WebAssembly, there is it's got to actually connect to the browser, obviously, to look at that code. Getting started, there's a ton of stuff to get started on Blazor. That same application I just showed you is the default one that you can go ahead and start with. You can do .NET New Blazor Server, .NET New Blazor WASM. I can show the performance stuff after this. I'm super excited for it. And thank you. So I don't know if I'll pull up that performance thing. Are there any questions from anyone? .NET 5. Please get it one. I'm sure I pulled this at the same time. Can you show or talk about model binding? Yeah. Okay, so let's do a model binding one. That's a good one. So how you can do model binding is they have an extra component here. So let's just go to a different page. Actually, we'll go to index. So I can use a regular HTML page, right? Or component, I should say, right? In input type equals text, right? That's just how it is. At code, let's just set a few things, public string, my text, okay? So if I do at value, or see, it even wants me to default to that one, right? So you can do bind value. Bind value lets me actually do two-way data binding with Blazor. So the way this works is by default, because it's value, and there's a few others that work, is value interacts with the JavaScript on change event. So there's a great article on how this actually works, where every time you do bind dash value, the way it renders is it actually renders an on change callback for you that will then tell Blazor to reset your text property. So if I do text equals my text, right? And then where's my terminal? There it is. No. I don't know, run this for you real quick. Basically, this input value should default to my text, but and I'll try to find a way to show it in a second. I don't want to write too much code, but it should also, when I change it, it will come back to .NET. So as you can see, it just bound to my text, right? And this is the same, right? So if I look at here, right, technically it's not binding because it's not in a property, but if I change count, it would update the page. The benefit of doing bind dash value is now it's two-way binding. So if I change the input, my .NET code is actually changing right now because I'm using that bind dash attribute. You can do this with custom components too. All it's looking for is an event callback. So if I set something like public event callback, event args, right? And my text has to be called your variable changed like this. I can now, if this was another component, I can now @bind dash my text, right? Because Blazor's smart enough to see, oh, there's a my text changed callback in the component, so I know I can bind to that value. So if you're creating your own custom components, you have to do the event callback yourself. But there's a lot of them out there, you know, input obviously being the most generic one, where you can bind dash something. And you can even control some of these too. So if I do, this will really explain it a lot better. It's a good question. Data binding, right? As you can see, right, this is how it renders. It does the on change for you to bind. But you can actually say bind current value. You can bind the event. So if I didn't want it to bind the value to on change, but bind it to on input, I could tell it to do that same thing. So there's a lot of customizations you can do, both with the attribute that you want to bind to and what the callback is to change it. If I look in the .NET Core updates real quick for release candidate 1, I know we were talking about it. Component virtualization, WebAssembly pre-rendering, JavaScript isolation, that CSS isolation I think came a little sooner. And here's just some of the performance, right? So the JSON serialize and deserialize, this is important because, again, you're not multi-threading, so you kind of have to be conscious of how much you're doing in that thread. Grid rendering performance, because they're doing some virtualization. This is another big thing. I think there was one more, maybe not. The big thing was they really bumped up that JSON serialization, which is great because that's how it goes back and forth between .NET, JavaScript, .NET is through that serialization. So they made some other improvements that I think they mentioned in another blog post about how they're actually converting .NET to WebAssembly code. But this is just a chart of just how they're doing just the JSON one, which is big. And Paul, I don't know if you have another. No, so there's no multi-threading for .NET 5. That's actually a limitation of WebAssembly, though. That's not a limitation of .NET. I think multi-threading does have a spec out there. Yeah, WebAssembly does have a spec out there for multi-threading, but it just hasn't been approved yet because obviously then all the browsers need to implement that. Because again, WebAssembly itself is only on 1.0. Async await works. And if you do JavaScript promises, it's technically like multi-threading. Like if you play around with it and you go into a JavaScript call with a promise, it's technically you're running in WebAssembly and JavaScript, right? So you can kind of use that to your advantage sometimes. That's why HTTP calls do not block your main thread, because if you make an HTTP call, it's actually doing it in JavaScript, which is separate than your WebAssembly code. Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Cool. If anyone has any further questions, you can reach out to me. It's just nathan.westfall@tylertech.com, or just contact us through the meetup. Chris and I are happy to reach out, help what we need. As I said, Blazor coming from mobile development has made it very easy to do web development. It just feels natural. It feels great to be able to do all this stuff with components, and it's just exciting to kind of see how web's moving because of this. So I know I've thoroughly enjoyed using some of this stuff. So, and with that, I'll stick around in case there's any other questions for a little bit, but officially this will be the end of